Hello, everyone. Today we bring you a romantic story set in London. Let's begin. We hope you enjoy it and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more meaningful stories. London, November, as the first chilly wind swept through the cobblestone streets of Westminster, the city that never sleeps buzzed with its usual vigor. Among the crowd was Edward Mercer, the 32-year-old CEO of Mercer Enterprises. Edward stood on the top floor of a gleaming glass tower, looking down at the stream of traffic like stars flowing beneath his feet. His deep blue eyes were sharp and cold, but within them lay a loneliness that no one could touch. Edward was the epitome of power, with sleek black hair, a chiseled face, and a demeanor that commanded respect. Yet, he was also a prisoner of his own family's legacy. Mercer Enterprises, a financial empire worth billions, was the legacy of the Mercer lineage. His father, Richard Mercer, a domineering man with silver hair and a gaze like a blade, issued an ultimatum at the morning board meeting. You must marry before your 33rd birthday, Edward. A man without a family isn't fit to lead this company. His voice was as cold as steel, leaving no room for negotiation. Edward clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. He despised the idea of marriage, especially arranged unions with high society women who only coveted power and wealth. To him, love was a luxury he could never trust, and everything in this world could be bought with money. Restless from the anger boiling within him, Edward decided to skip the elite gala he had planned to attend that evening. Instead, he received a cryptic invitation from an acquaintance in high society. It was for a charity auction. The man's tone was laced with intrigue. Edward cared little for charity, but the prospect of a power game piqued his curiosity. "Fine," he replied. "I'll see what it's about." The auction took place in a clandestine salon at the Ritz Hotel, where crystal chandeliers cast light on gilded walls. The small but opulent room was reserved for the wealthiest and boldest men in expensive tuxedos sat around round tables, their eyes sharp as hawks. On stage, the MC, a middle-aged woman with a polished smile, introduced the evening's concept. Beautiful ladies would auction off an evening of their time, a dinner, a conversation, or whatever the gentleman desired within the bounds of propriety. The room erupted in soft laughter, but Edward sat still, twirling his whiskey glass, his cold gaze scanning the crowd. The women took the stage one by one, each distinct, from haughty muses in glittering gowns to seductive women with calculated smiles. Edward was unmoved. He was here to prove one thing: everything, even people, had a price. But then the MC introduced the final participant, Clara Bennett, a 24-year-old with a pure soul and a smile as warm as sunlight. The door opened and Clara stepped forward. She wore a simple white dress, knee-length, unadorned by jewelry or heavy makeup. Her soft brown hair fell loosely, framing a delicate face. Her large brown eyes shimmered with shyness, yet held an indescribable resilience. She stood there, hands clasped tightly like a flower lost in a desert. The room fell silent, and for the first time that evening, Edward sat up straight. His heart stirred faintly, a strange sensation he quickly suppressed. Just a girl, he told himself, but his eyes couldn't leave her. The bidding began. Numbers were called out rapidly. £10,000, £20,000, £50,000. A middle-aged man with a sparkling diamond ring raised his paddle to £100,000. Clara stood on the stage, her face pale, hands trembling. She clearly didn't want to be there, and that intrigued Edward. Why would a girl like her play this game? He smirked, raised his paddle, and his deep, steady voice echoed through the room, £1,000,000. The room froze, shocked. Gazes turned toward him. The MC stammered, £1,000,000 from Mr. Edward Mercer. Any higher bids? No one dared. Clara looked down at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She couldn't fathom why this stranger with icy eyes would spend a fortune just to buy an evening with her. Edward stood, buttoning his suit jacket, a defiant half-smile on his lips. He didn't care about the consequences. This was his message to his family, to the world. He controlled the game, and no one could force his hand. When the auction ended, Clara was brought to meet Edward. She stood before him, small and fragile in her white dress. "Miss Bennet," he said, extending his hand like it was a business deal. "One evening, as agreed. Let's go." Clara took his hand, trembling, feeling as though she were stepping into a world where she didn't belong. Her fingers were cold, but her gentle grip made Edward pause for a second. He looked into her eyes, and in that moment, a vague premonition passed through him. This decision wasn't just a game, but the beginning of something far greater. They left the salon, stepping into London's dark night. Neither Edward nor Clara could have known that this moment would change their lives forever. One evening, £1 million, and a destiny already set waiting to unfold. Clara Bennett stood behind the counter of a small bakery in London's Hackney neighborhood, her hands deftly wrapped fragrant butter cookies. Her brown hair was tied up high, with a few stray strands falling across her flour-dusted forehead. At 24, Clara possessed a natural beauty that needed no makeup. Large, doe-like brown eyes, smooth pale skin, and a warm smile that could chase away the chill of London's autumn. But behind that smile was a heart heavy with worry, a life full of struggles she tried to conceal. Clara grew up in a cramped, run-down apartment where she and her younger sister Lily were all that remained of their family. Their parents died in a car accident when Clara was 15, leaving the sisters with a few old belongings and a small debt. Clara became Lily's guardian, abandoning her dream of college to work day and night. She took every job she could, waitressing, delivering newspapers, cleaning houses, and now working at Sweet Haven Bakery. Every penny she earned went to Lily, her 16-year-old sister who suffered from a congenital heart condition. Lily was Clara's light, the reason she got up each morning even when exhaustion threatened to break her. Lily's condition was worsening. Sudden heart pain sent her to the hospital repeatedly, and each time Clara felt her own heart constrict. A week ago, the doctor summoned Clara to the hospital with devastating news. Lily needed an emergency heart surgery costing £200,000. Without the surgery within 3 months, she wouldn't make it. The doctor said, his voice heavy with sorrow. Clara held Lily's hand, watching her sleep in the hospital bed, her pale lips curved in a faint smile. Clara couldn't let her sister go, never. Clara scrambled for solutions. She borrowed from friends and sold her silver necklace, the only keepsake from her mother. But she scraped together just a few £1,000s. In her desperation, she met Sarah, an old friend who worked for a secretive charity organization. Sarah proposed something Clara had never participated in, a charity auction where women sold an evening of their time to raise funds. "It's just dinner and conversation," Sarah reassured her. "You'll make money and no one will harm you." They're wealthy, refined people. Clara shook her head, her heart resisting. She didn't want to compromise her dignity or become a commodity. But then she looked into Lily's eyes, heard the steady beep of the heart monitor, and knew she had no choice. Just this once, Clara whispered to herself as she signed the contract to participate. She insisted clearly, dinner only, nothing more. The organizers nodded, but their calculating gazes held a cunning Clara, and her naivety didn't notice. She thought it was just a meal, a conversation, and the money would save Lily's life. She wasn't prepared for what was coming on the night of the auction. Clara stood backstage at the Ritz Hotel, her trembling hands clutching the hem of her white dress. She heard the MC introducing the other women, the laughter and applause from the audience. Her heart pounded as if it might burst. When her name was called, she took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The dazzling chandelier lights blinded her, and she felt hundreds of eyes scrutinizing her. She stood there, small and fragile, like a bird trapped in an iron cage. Clara Bennett, 24 years old, a pure soul with a smile as warm as sunlight, the MC announced. Clara forced a smile, though her lips trembled. The bidding began. The numbers climbed quickly, £10,000, £50,000, £100,000. Clara kept her head down, avoiding the crowd's gaze. She just wanted it to end so she could return to Lily, but then a deep, cold voice cut through the noise. £1,000,000. Clara looked up, stunned. Her eyes found a man in the audience. He was tall, dressed in a black suit, his face sharp and cold as if carved from stone. His deep blue eyes locked onto hers, devoid of emotion, yet something in them made her shiver. Edward Mercer. She didn't know who he was, but the £1,000,000 bid silenced the room. After the auction, Clara was brought to meet Edward. She stood before him, feeling like she faced a wall of ice. "Miss Bennett," he said, extending his hand. Clara took it, her fingers cold. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Edward raised an eyebrow, a mocking half-smile on his lips. I wanted to prove everything has a price, including you. 500,000 pounds for one evening, cheaper than I expected. His words stabbed Claire's heart like a knife. She clenched her fists, her eyes flashing with hurt. You can buy my time, but not my self-respect, she replied, her voice trembling but not weak. Edward paused, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but he quickly masked it and turned away. We'll see, he said coldly, motioning for her to follow. They entered a luxurious restaurant, its warm golden lights a stark contrast to Edward's icy demeanor. Clara sat across from him, her hands resting on her lap, trying to stay calm. She thought of Lily, the money that would save her sister's life, and told herself she just had to get through this night. But she didn't know that by stepping into Edward Mercer's opulent, ruthless world, she had unwittingly entered a stormy destiny where her heart would be tested, wounded, and ultimately healed by the very man now watching her with eyes that seemed ready to devour the world. The dinner at the upscale London restaurant had ended, but Edward Mercer couldn't erase Clara Bennett from his mind. She had sat across from him, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes a mix of defiance and hurt. Unlike the women who had crossed his path, polished, calculating, always eager to please, Clara was entirely different. She didn't flirt, didn't fawn over his wealth, didn't even try to impress him. When he threw a biting remark about buying her time, she shot back sharply, her self-respect unshaken. You can buy my time, but not my self-respect. Her words echoed in his head, stirring an unfamiliar feeling in his chest. For the first time in years, Edward felt drawn to someone. The next morning, in his sleek office overlooking Hyde Park, Edward sat at his mahogany desk, the city sprawling below. His assistant had just delivered a file on Clara Bennett, compiled overnight at his request. The file was thin, her life sketched out in a few pages. Orphaned at 15, sole guardian of her sister Lily, who had a congenital heart condition. Clara worked at a bakery, lived in a rundown Hackney apartment, had no criminal record, no social media presence, no blemishes. Her life was the polar opposite of Edward's glamorous world. Yet, she carried a quiet strength that he couldn't stop thinking about. He leaned back in his chair, studying the photo attached to the file, a candid shot of Clara smiling at a customer in the bakery, her face gentle and unguarded. Why had she agreed to the auction? The answer was obvious: medical bills for her sister. £1,000,000 would cover the surgery and more. But what struck Edward was that she didn't play the game. She asked for nothing beyond the agreed-upon evening, didn't linger or hint at wanting more. In a world where everyone wanted a piece of him, Clara Bennett was an exception. His father's ultimatum hung over him like a blade: marry within a year or lose control of Mercer Corporation. The idea of a loveless arranged marriage with an heiress chosen by his family repulsed him. But Clara, she was an enigma, someone who didn't belong in the world of schemes and alliances. A bold idea took shape. What if he could use her to meet his family's demands while keeping his freedom? A marriage in name only, a business deal. She needed money. He needed a wife. It was perfect. A week later, Edward drove to Sweet Haven, the bakery where Clara worked. The bell jingled as he stepped inside, his presence out of place in the cozy, flower-scented space. Clara stood behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Mr. Mercer," she said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" He didn't beat around the bush. "I have a proposition, Miss Bennett." He gestured to a small table in the corner, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat down, her gaze wary. Edward leaned forward, his voice low and clear. "Marry me for 1 year. I'll cover all medical expenses for your sister, surgery, aftercare, everything. You'll want for nothing in return. You play the role of my wife to satisfy my family's demands." Clara stared at him, her breath catching. "Are you serious?" she whispered, searching his face for any sign of a joke. "Why me? You could choose anyone." "Because you're convenient," he said bluntly, hiding the truth that her authenticity, her lack of pretense, made her the only person he could tolerate for this charade. "You don't want my world, and I don't want yours. This is a clean deal. No love, no strings, just business." Clara's hands trembled in her lap. The offer was a lifeline, a miracle for Lily, but it came at a cost she could barely stomach. Marrying a stranger, stepping into his world of wealth and power, it terrified her. She thought of Lily, her pale face in the hospital bed, her whispered dreams of seeing the ocean. Clara's heart ached. She couldn't afford to say no, not when her sister's life hung in the balance. I need time to think, she said, her voice faint. Edward nodded, sliding a business card across the table. You have 24 hours. Call me. That night, Clara sat by Lily's hospital bed, the steady beep of the heart monitor filling the quiet room. Lily slept, her chest rising and falling weakly. Clara held her hand, tears stinging her eyes. She imagined a future where Lily was healthy, laughing, free from pain. Then she thought of Edward, his cold eyes, his world of glass and steel. Could she do this? Could she bind herself to a man who saw her as a means to an end? The next morning, she made her decision. She dialed the number on the card, her voice steady, despite her knotted stomach. I agree, she said when Edward answered, but only for 1 year and only for Lily. Good, he replied curtly. My lawyers will send the contract. Prepare to move in by the weekend. The contract arrived the next day, a thick stack of legal jargon outlining the terms. A 1-year marriage, no expectations of emotional or physical intimacy, a monthly allowance for Clara, and full coverage of Lily's medical expenses. She packed her few belongings, a handful of clothes, a photo of her and Lily, a worn copy of Anne of Green Gables, and left her old life behind. Edward's London penthouse was another world. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. The modern furniture gleamed, and the air carried a faint, expensive sterility. Clara felt like an intruder, her sneakers squeaking on the marble floor. Edward greeted her with a nod, his expression unreadable. Your room is down the hall, he said. The staff will handle anything you need. Clara nodded, clutching her bag tightly. Thank you, she said softly, though the words felt hollow. She was here for Lily, she told herself. Nothing else mattered. The first weeks were a stark contrast. Edward was rarely home, his days consumed by meetings, his evenings filled with galas or business dinners. When they crossed paths, their conversations were polite but distant, like strangers sharing a space. Clara spent her days at the hospital with Lily, whose condition stabilized with the prospect of surgery. She avoided the luxuries of Edward's world, the designer clothes in her closet, the chauffeured car waiting downstairs. She cooked simple meals like spaghetti or soup, leaving portions in the fridge, though she never saw Edward touch them. But Edward noticed her. He saw how she folded her own clothes, refusing the staff's help. He noticed the worn books she read in quiet moments, her fingers tracing the pages. He heard her softly hum a melody that lingered in his mind. Clara was a puzzle, a woman who didn't belong in his world, but somehow anchored at point one evening. After a grueling day of negotiations, Edward came home and found Clara in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. The sight stopped him cold. No one had ever cooked for him, not his mother, long gone, nor the chefs his money could hire. What are you doing? He asked, his tone sharper than intended. Clara flinched, nearly dropping the ladle. I'm making soup, she said, her cheeks flushing. I thought you might be hungry. He stared at her, the weight of her simple gesture unsettling him. You didn't have to do that, he said, but he sat at the counter, accepting the bowl she offered. The soup was carrots, potatoes, a hint of thyme, but it warmed him in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in years, Edward felt a flicker of peace. Their marriage was a contract, a performance. They appeared together at events, Clara in elegant gowns that made her look like she belonged, though her eyes betrayed her discomfort. Edward introduced her as his wife, his hand resting lightly on her back, a gesture that felt oddly natural. To the world, they were the perfect couple. In private, they were strangers bound by paper and necessity, but as time passed, Edward began to watch Clara more closely. He saw her kindness and how she spoke to hospital staff, her strength as she held Lily's hand through rough days. He started to dread the day the contract would end, when she would leave with her sister's health secured and no reason to stay. For the first time, Edward wondered if he could change the rules of the game, if he could make her want to stay, not for money, but for him. Clara felt the shift too. She noticed Edward's gaze softened when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he lingered in the kitchen when she cooked. She told herself it meant nothing, that their marriage was a transaction, not a relationship. But deep down, she felt the first stirrings of something dangerous, something that could shatter her heart if she let it grow. They were playing a game. Neither had anticipated a dance of closeness and restraint. As the months passed, the lines of their contract began to blur, paving the way for a love neither was ready to admit, a storm that would tear them apart. 3 months after Clara Bennett stepped into the opulent world of Edward Mercer, the cold millionaire CEO of Mercer Corporation, the London penthouse was no longer an icy fortress. The glass walls and sleek furnishings, once symbols of isolation, now carried a subtle warmth that Edward didn't immediately recognize. Clara, with her warm heart and sincerity, had quietly seeped into the cracks of the CEO's soul, a place he once believed nothing could touch. Clara lived in Edward's world like a guest, always keeping her distance from his wealth. She spent most of her time at the hospital with Lily, her sister, who was growing stronger thanks to the money from the auction paid by the millionaire CEO. At home, Clara did simple things: folded clothes, read books, or cooked modest meals. Edward, accustomed to extravagance, initially paid little attention. He was often absent, immersed in meetings or social events where he and Clara appeared as the perfect elite couple. But when he returned, the CEO began to notice the small traces Clara left behind. One evening, after a long day battling shareholder pressures, Edward came home late, exhausted and irritable. He stepped into the kitchen where the aroma of chicken and vegetable soup filled the air. Clara stood there, wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, her brown hair tied high, a few strands dusted with flour. She flinched when she saw the CEO, nearly dropping the ladle. "I made soup," she said, her cheeks flushing. "I thought you might be hungry." Edward looked at her, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. No one had ever cooked for him, not his mother, long gone, nor the top chefs his money could hire. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice flat, but he sat at the counter, accepting the bowl she offered. The soup was simple: carrots, potatoes, a hint of herbs, but it warmed him in a way he couldn't explain. The CEO ate in silence, spoonful by spoonful, while Clara quietly cleaned up. That small moment made Edward, the millionaire CEO, feel a peace he didn't know he craved. From then on, Edward began to notice Clara more. He realized she never touched the allowance provided by the CEO, didn't shop for luxuries, or flaunt her title as Mrs. Mercer. She kept her worn copy of Anne of Green Gables close, reading it while waiting for Lily at the hospital. He heard her hum softly while wiping down the table, a gentle melody the CEO started to look forward to daily. Clara didn't try to charm the CEO, but her kindness and patience made it impossible for him to remain indifferent. One day, Clara brought home a small box from the hospital. "Lily made this," she said, handing the CEO a clumsily folded paper crane. "She wanted to thank you." Edward held the crane, his fingers tracing its uneven folds. He tried folding one to send back, but ended up with a crumpled mess. Clara laughed, a sound as clear as wind chimes. "The CEO needs more practice," she teased, and her smile made Edward's heart skip a beat. Such moments piled up. Clara listened patiently when the CEO inadvertently spoke of the pressures from his father. Her eyes, free of judgment, brought him comfort. She cried with joy when the doctor announced Lily's surgery was a success, and Edward, without thinking, pulled her into his arms. "She'll be okay," the CEO whispered, feeling her tremble in his embrace. Clara didn't push the CEO away, and in that moment he felt a connection that contract couldn't define. They began sharing small moments beyond public appearances. One evening, Clara convinced the CEO to watch The Sound of Music on TV. Edward grumbled but sat on the couch, keeping a safe distance. When she sang along to Edelweiss in a clear voice, the CEO couldn't look away. "You sing well," he said. Clara blushed, muttering, "Just for fun." But to the CEO, it wasn't just for fun. It was a part of her, and he wanted to hold on to it. Edward, the cold CEO, began to change without realizing it. He canceled events to come home earlier, finding excuses to be near Clara. He bought a bouquet of white daisies from a roadside shop, not expensive roses, because they reminded the CEO of her. When he gave her the flowers, he fumbled like a schoolboy. "I thought these suited you," the CEO said. Clara took the bouquet, her eyes surprised, then smiled, a genuine smile that made the CEO want to freeze time. These changes unnerved Edward. The CEO had never wanted anyone to stay by his side, never considered dismantling the walls he'd built. But Clara, with her warmth and patience, had done the impossible. She made the millionaire CEO yearn for something money couldn't buy. He began to imagine a future without the contract, where Clara stayed with him not for money, but because she felt what he was feeling. One night, as Clara fell asleep on the couch, her book slipping from her hands, Edward stood watching her. The soft glow of a table lamp illuminated her face, her long lashes trembling slightly, her lips parted. The CEO gently draped a blanket over her, his movements slow as if afraid to wake her. Standing there, he whispered so low he could barely hear himself, "If I proposed to you for real, would you say yes?" The question hung unanswered, but it marked an undeniable truth. Edward Mercer, the millionaire CEO, was in love. The CEO began to think about tearing up the contract. He wanted to tell Clara he didn't want her to leave when the year ended. He wanted to kneel, not with a diamond ring, but with an honest heart, and ask her to stay forever. But the CEO hesitated, not out of fear of rejection, but because he feared Clara might think he was manipulating her, as he once claimed everything had a price. He needed time to prove his feelings were real, that he was no longer the cold man who met her at the auction. Clara, in her own heart, felt the shift too. She noticed how the CEO looked at her, his gaze no longer cold but tender, as if she were something precious. She saw him linger when she talked about Lily, asking questions a CEO only interested in a contract wouldn't ask. She began to look forward to their moments together, the meals they shared, the times he unexpectedly showed up at the hospital to drive her home. But she reminded herself this was just a contract. Edward, the cold CEO, didn't believe in love, and she couldn't let her heart break. Yet the CEO's small gestures, the daisies, the paper crane he tried to fold for Lily, the way he stood in the rain to pick her up, made her waver. She began to wonder if the millionaire CEO felt what she was feeling, a stirring knot written in any clause. She was afraid, but also hopeful that what was growing between them was real. They stood on a dangerous precipice, where the contract was merely an excuse to be near each other. Edward, the millionaire CEO, wanted to break every bond to tell Clara he loved her. But he didn't know that just as the CEO was ready to open his heart, a storm was coming, a misunderstanding that would tear apart everything they'd built, plunging them into darkness before the light could return. Winter draped a misty veil over London streets, but in Edward Mercer's heart, a warm fire burned. The months with Clara had changed him. The man who once believed everything had a price now yearned for something money couldn't buy, Clara's heart. He hadn't dared say it, but every genuine smile, every meal she cooked, every moment she touched his life convinced him she was the one he wanted forever. Clara felt the change, too. She no longer called him Mr. Mercer in private moments, and Edward's gaze when he looked at her was no longer cold but tender, as if she were the most precious thing in his world. Yet she was afraid. The marriage contract, though now a pretext for their closeness, remained an invisible wall. She told herself not to love him, but her heart disobeyed. Each time he brought home white daisies, each time he sat with her in the hospital waiting for news about Lily, she felt herself falling into a love she dared not admit. Meanwhile, a shadow loomed silently. Sophia Mercer, Edward's 26-year-old sister, was a haughty woman raised in luxury with golden blonde hair and sharp eyes. Sophia was the epitome of charm and ambition. She loved her brother, but her love was tinged with selfishness. Edward had always protected her, shielding her from trouble, and she didn't want to lose him to anyone, especially Clara, a poor girl. Sophia despised her, muttering, "She's only after his money." Though deep down she knew Clara wasn't like the women who flocked to her brother, Sophia noticed the change in Edward. He smiled more. His eyes lit up when he mentioned Clara. He canceled parties to come home early, declined a dinner with an heiress Sophia had deliberately arranged. Clara's presence made Sophia feel threatened, and she decided she had to act before Clara took her brother away for good. The opportunity came when Sophia hired a private investigator to follow Clara. She wanted proof that Clara was unworthy. The investigator discovered Ethan, Clara's childhood best friend, who had recently returned to London after years abroad. Ethan, an engineer with a kind smile, contacted Clara to offer help with Lily's medical bills, though she firmly declined. One afternoon at the hospital, Ethan visited Lily and hugged Clara to comfort her as she cried from worry. That moment, though purely platonic, was captured by Sophia's hired photographer. Sophia didn't stop there. She hired an expert to manipulate the photo, turning the hug into a more intimate scene. Clara and Ethan in a secluded corner, their gazes like those of lovers. She fabricated text messages, making it seem like Clara was secretly communicating with Ethan to exploit Edward. The evidence was sealed in an envelope, accompanied by Sophia's handwritten note. "Brother, she's deceiving you. I warned you." That evening, Edward returned to the penthouse after a long day. He had planned to tell Clara how he felt, to propose canceling the contract and starting anew, not for family or money, but because he loved her. But when he opened his phone, he received Sophia's message with the attached files. He opened the photo, and his blood ran cold. Clara, the woman he loved, was in another man's arms, their eyes seemingly sharing a secret. The fake text read, "I can't wait until the contract ends. He suspects nothing." The words stabbed his heart like knives. Jealousy erupted, mingling with profound pain. He had opened his heart, believed Clara was different, but now she seemed just another deceiver, like those who approached him for money and power. He gripped his phone, hands trembling, eyes darkening. He couldn't take it anymore. Clara came home at midnight, exhausted from a long day at the hospital. She stepped into the penthouse, the dim lights casting shadows on Edward's figure by the window, his back to her. "Edward," she called softly, sensing the tension. He turned, his deep blue eyes as cold as ice, devoid of any warmth. He tossed the photo onto the table, his voice low but sharp. "Explain this." Clara looked down, stunned to see the image of herself and Ethan. She recognized the moment, the brief hug at the hospital when Ethan comforted her, but the photo was distorted, made to look like a clandestine meeting. "This is Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "He's my childhood friend. He was just helping with Lily's medical bills. It's not what you think." But Edward wouldn't listen. Jealousy and pain clouded his reason. "Do you think I'm stupid enough to believe that?" he roared, his voice shaking with anger. "You played your part well. You made me believe you were different, that you didn't care about money or power. But you're just like the rest, a two-timing opportunist." Clara shook her head, tears spilling over. "No, Edward. I swear I never deceived you. She choked, wanting to say she loved him, that she had fallen for him through the small moments they shared, but the words caught in her throat. She stepped forward, trying to touch his arm, but he jerked away, his gaze slicing her heart like a blade. "You got what you wanted," he said, his voice so cold it made her shudder. "Money for your sister, a luxurious life. But I'm not someone you can toy with. The contract is over. Get out. I never want to see you again." Clara stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to scream, to explain, but Edward's eyes, once so tender, now held only contempt. "Please listen to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. But he turned away, his back an impenetrable wall. Silently, she gathered her few possessions, the worn book, Lily's photo, a few clothes. She took nothing from his world, not out of pride, but because she couldn't bear to take anything from the place that shattered her heart. Before leaving, she paused at the door, looking at him one last time. "I never wanted your money or power," she said, her voice faint but resolute. "I only wanted you to trust me." He didn't respond, standing motionless, eyes fixed on the window as if she had vanished from his world. Clara stepped out of the penthouse, the door's closing sound like a final cut. She carried her broken heart into London's frigid night, unaware that the days ahead would be even crueler. In the penthouse, solitude enveloped Edward. He clutched the photo, his fingers white from gripping it. He didn't want to acknowledge the pain roaring in his chest. He told himself he was right, that Clara was a liar, that love was a game he shouldn't have trusted. But deep down, a small voice questioned whether he was making the greatest mistake of his life. Sophia, in her lavish apartment, smiled with satisfaction. She had protected her brother from a gold digger, but she didn't know the trap she'd set didn't just destroy Clara. It was pulling Edward into an abyss of regret and loss. This cruel misunderstanding had torn two hearts apart, and only time and a painful truth could bring them back together. Clara Bennett stepped out of Edward Mercer's penthouse on a frigid winter night, carrying a shattered heart. The sound of the door closing behind her was like a final knife severing every hope she had foolishly nurtured. She didn't cry, didn't look back. Her feet moved aimlessly through London's streets, the biting wind gnawing at her skin, but she felt nothing. The pain in her heart dwarfed any cold. Edward's words echoed in her mind, "You're just like everyone else, only after money and power." An indelible verdict. Clara returned to her old Hackney apartment, the one she'd lived in before entering Edward's world. The small, dilapidated space with its stained walls and musty smell was now her only refuge. She sat on the creaky bed, clutching a photo of herself and Lily, her sister. Her eyes were vacant. She wanted to call Lily, to hear her bright voice, but she couldn't. How could she face her sister when she had failed, when she had let love, something she thought was real, destroy her? 3 days later, a call from the hospital shattered Clara's world. The doctor's voice trembled over the phone. "Miss Bennett, I'm so sorry. Lily didn't make it. An unexpected complication after the surgery. We did everything we could." Clara gripped the phone, her breath catching. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It can't be." But the doctor only repeated his apologies, and then the world around her went dark. Clara went to the hospital, her legs heavy as lead. She stood by Lily's bed, staring at her sister lying there, her face pale but serene as if asleep. Clara took Lily's hand, now cold, and for the first time since leaving Edward, she cried. Silent tears fell without sound, as if even her pain had run dry. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I promised to protect you. I'm sorry, Lily." Lily, the only light in Clara's life, was gone. She had no one left, no family, no love, no faith. The double blow of Edward's misunderstanding and expulsion, followed by Lily's death, crushed Clara. She had no strength left to fight, to hope. She returned to her apartment, living like a shadow. Each day she woke, worked at a small coffee shop, and came back. Her body moved like a machine. She no longer cried, laughed, or felt anything. Her once sparkling brown eyes were now empty, an abyss without end. Clara stopped reading, stopped saying, stopped dreaming. She couldn't bear to keep the photo of herself and Lily, as each glance felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She worked, ate, slept, but it was mere existence, not life. Those around her noticed the change. "She's like a ghost," one coworker whispered. But Clara didn't care. She was no longer Clara Bennett, the girl with a warm smile and a resilient heart. She was just a shell drifting through days in despair point. 2 months later, Edward Mercer stood in his office, gazing down at London City. The glamour of the millionaire CEO held no meaning anymore. Since the night he drove Clara away, he had lived in a state of numbness. He told himself he was right, that Clara had betrayed him. But every night, as the penthouse sat stiflingly silent, he couldn't escape the emptiness. The bouquet of white daisies he'd once given her remained in a cabinet, wilted, a reminder of what he'd lost. The truth came unexpectedly like a hammer blow. A disgruntled former employee of Sophia's contacted Edward and revealed everything. Miss Sophia hired someone to edit the photo, the man said, sending him the original image, a simple hug between Clara and Ethan in the hospital, entirely innocent. The fabricated text messages were exposed too, along with invoices for the private investigator and photo editor. Edward sat frozen, clutching his phone, feeling the ground collapse beneath him. He confronted Sophia in her apartment. "Tell me," he roared, his voice trembling with rage. Faced with her brother's blazing eyes, Sophia couldn't hide anymore. She broke down, confessing, "I just wanted to protect you. She didn't belong in our world. I thought she'd use you, take everything." But her excuses only deepened his pain. "She was everything to me," he said, his voice breaking, "and you destroyed her." The truth stabbed Edward's heart like a blade. Clara was innocent. She hadn't deceived him, hadn't played him. She had told the truth, begged him to believe her, but he, blinded by jealousy, had cast her out, destroying the most precious thing in his life with his own hands. He recalled Clara's eyes that night, not angry, not resentful, only deeply hurt. He had been wrong, unforgivably wrong. Edward abandoned everything. He handed control of Mercer Corporation to the board, cut ties with his family, especially Sophia. Wealth, power, prestige, the things that once meant everything to him now meant nothing. He had one mission: to find Clara, even if only to beg for her forgiveness, knowing she might never want to see him again. He hired private investigators to scour every corner of London, but Clara had vanished. She was no longer at her old apartment, no longer working at the bakery or coffee shop. He went to the hospital, only to be struck by devastating news. Lily had died shortly after Clara left him. Edward stood in the hospital corridor, fists clenched, feeling his heart shatter. Clara hadn't just lost him, she'd lost her only family. He had pushed her into hell, and now she was somewhere enduring her pain alone. The final clue led him to a small town on the outskirts of London. A former co-worker from the coffee shop revealed that Clara had moved away after Lily's death, leaving no forwarding address. Edward didn't give up. He drove for hours, questioning locals, checking every small cafe and shop. He didn't know what he'd say if he found her, but he needed to see her, to know she was alive, even if just a shadow of herself. In the empty penthouse, the wilted daisies remained a reminder of his mistake. Edward, once the invincible millionaire CEO, was now just a man with a broken heart, haunted by Clara, the woman he loved and the one he had destroyed. He didn't know if he could atone, but he would never stop searching, even if it took a lifetime to mend what he had broken. Rain poured relentlessly over the small, forgotten town of Greenfield on the outskirts of London, where muddy dirt roads and weathered wooden houses told tales of hardship. Edward Mercer, once the epitome of power and wealth, stood beneath the downpour, his black suit soaked, hair plastered to his forehead. He was no longer the invincible millionaire CEO of Mercer Corporation. He was just a man with a broken heart, haunted by a singular mission: to find Clara Bennett, the woman he had destroyed with his own foolishness. 2 months had passed since Sophia's scheme was exposed, and Edward had abandoned everything: his company, his reputation, his family. He lived like a pilgrim, chasing every faint clue about Clara, from her dilapidated Hackney apartment to the hospital where Lily died. He had scoured every corner, questioned every person, checked every cafe and shop. Finally, a vague tip from one of Clara's former coworkers led him to Greenfield. She moved to a small town, the coworker had said, but she's not the Clara you knew. Edward arrived in Greenfield on a bleak winter afternoon as rain began to fall. Stepping out of a modest rental car, the tiny town unfolded before him. A main street with a few ramshackle shops, an old cafe, and locals hurrying under umbrellas to escape the wet. He didn't know where Clara was, but instinct told him she was close. He entered the town's only cafe, the Rusty Spoon, hoping to find a trace of her. Inside, the scent of coffee mingled with freshly baked pastries. Edward scanned the small room, and then his heart stopped. Clara stood behind the counter, wearing a worn green apron, her brown hair loosely tied, a few strands falling across her gaunt face. She was wiping a glass, her movements slow as if she weren't truly present. The Clara of 3 months ago, the girl with a warm smile and sparkling brown eyes, was gone. The woman before him was frail, her skin pale, her eyes hollow like an endless abyss. She had no vitality, no light. Clara Bennett had become a shadow. Edward stood frozen, rain dripping from his coat onto the floor. He wanted to call her name, to run to her, but his feet felt nailed to the ground. A coworker beside Clara noticed him, whispering something, but Clara only nodded, not looking up. She didn't know he was there, and that ignorance pained him more than any accusation could. He stepped outside, unable to bear the thought of facing her in that cramped space. The rain continued, icy and unrelenting, but he stood beneath it, waiting. He needed to see her, to speak to her, even knowing she might never forgive him. When Clara's shift ended, she emerged from the cafe's back door, clutching a thin coat and a small umbrella, barely shielding her from the rain. She didn't look around, just walked with her head down as if the world had ceased to exist. "Clara," Edward called, his voice hoarse, cutting through the sound of the rain. She stopped, her shoulders trembling slightly, but didn't turn. He ran to her, rain soaking through his clothes, his heart pounding. "Clara, please look at me." She turned slowly, and when their eyes met, Edward felt as if he'd been stabbed. Clara's large brown eyes, once radiant like sunlight, were now lifeless. No anger, no resentment, not even pain, just an emptiness that suffocated him. She looked at him, but it was as if she saw through him, as if he were no longer part of her world. "Clara," he said, his voice breaking, "I've searched everywhere for you. I was wrong. I didn't know the truth. Sophia fabricated everything. The photo, the messages, all fake. I didn't trust you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Rain fell into her hair, dripping down her cheeks, but she didn't blink. Edward stepped closer, narrowing the distance, though each step felt like treading on thorns. I know I don't deserve it, he continued, his voice trembling. I know I destroyed everything, but please give me a chance to make it right. I can't live without you. He dropped to his knees right there in the muddy street, rain seeping through his pants, chilling him to the bone. If you can't love me anymore, he said, his eyes blurring with rain and tears, please let me love you for the rest of my life. Just let me be near you, even if it's from a distance. I ask for nothing more. Clara looked at him, her face expressionless, no anger, no blame, no forgiveness. Her eyes were an invisible wall, separating them into two different worlds. Her pain wasn't hatred, but a profound loss too vast for any plea to reach. Edward, kneeling in the rain, felt his heart shatter into pieces. He had thought finding her would bring hope, but her lifeless gaze told him some wounds could never heal. Clara, please, he whispered, his voice fading. Say something. Yell at me. Tell me to leave. Don't stay silent like this. But she just stood there, her small umbrella tilted, rain streaming down her face. Finally, she turned and walked away, her slight figure fading into the misty rain. Edward didn't follow. He stayed kneeling, motionless, letting the rain wash away what little strength he had left. He had found her only to realize the Clara he knew was gone. In the days that followed, Edward didn't leave Greenfield. He rented a small house on the town's outskirts, living like an ordinary man far removed from the glamour that once defined him. He went to the cafe daily, not to talk, but to watch Clara from afar. She worked, served customers, but her empty gaze never changed. She didn't smile, barely spoke, merely existed. Each time he saw her, the pain cut like a knife, but he couldn't leave. He had destroyed her, and now he only wanted to be near, even as a meaningless shadow in her life. Clara knew he was there. She saw him sitting in the corner, his coffee growing cold, but she said nothing, didn't look at him. She had no strength left to be angry, to blame, to forgive. Losing Lily, losing Edward, losing herself, it had stripped her of all emotion. She lived out of habit, not hope. And Edward, with all his love and regret, was just a part of a past she couldn't face. The pain between them was greater than hatred. It was an unfillable void, a wordless wound. Edward didn't know if he could bring Clara back, but he wouldn't give up. Under Greenfield's cold rain, he had sworn to himself he would stay no matter how long, even if she never forgave him. Because Clara, even as a shadow, was still his entire world. The rain had stopped falling in Greenfield, but the chill of winter still seeped through the muddy roads and weathered wooden houses. Edward Mercer, once a symbol of power in London, now lived in a modest house on the town's outskirts, far from the glamour of his past. He no longer wore tailored suits or ran a financial empire. Instead, he donned a flannel shirt and muddy boots, dedicating his days to bringing Clara Bennett back, not with words, but with patience and unconditional love. Clara, after the night Edward knelt in the rain, begging for forgiveness, remained a shadow. She worked at the Rusty Spoon Cafe, serving customers with mechanical movements, her eyes an empty abyss. Losing Lily, losing faith in love, losing herself, she had no strength left to feel. She knew Edward was in Greenfield, saw him sitting in the cafe's corner each day, but she said nothing, didn't look at him. He was part of a past she couldn't face. Though her broken heart stirred faintly when he was near, Clara didn't push. She understood that apologies, however sincere, couldn't erase the pain he'd caused. Instead, he chose to stay, quietly protecting and caring for Clara from a distance. He started with small acts. One morning, noticing her rented wooden house on the town's edge had a leaky roof, he fixed it without her knowledge. He bought materials, learned to use a hammer and nails from a local carpenter, and worked under the pale sun. When Clara returned, the roof was sealed, a note reading "fixed" left on her doorstep. Clara looked at the note, her hands trembling slightly, but she said nothing, stepping inside. Such gestures continued. Edward noticed Clara walked home each night on a dark, unlit path. He quietly installed solar-powered lamps along the route, ensuring her safety without her knowing. He saw she often forgot lunch, so each morning he left a sandwich box at the cafe's door, unsigned. Clara ate, though she never spoke of it, and Edward, watching from afar, felt a flicker of hope. One day, the cafe was short a kitchen helper. Despite never having cooked, Edward volunteered to work for free. The kind-hearted owner, a middle-aged man, agreed. Edward fumbled through chopping vegetables, boiling eggs, and burning toast before improving. Clara, working at the counter, couldn't miss him, his dark hair disheveled, hands clumsily wielding a knife, sweat beading on his forehead. She said nothing, but sometimes her gaze lingered on him longer than usual, as if trying to understand why he stayed. Edward learned to cook not because he was skilled, but to bring Clara the warmth she'd once given him. One evening, as the cafe closed, he left a plate of homemade spaghetti on the counter with a note, "You need to eat something." Clara looked at the plate, the tomato sauce sloppy, and for the first time in months, she gave a small, fleeting smile. Enough for Edward, watching from a distance, to feel his heart pound. He began picking wildflowers from a field near town, daisies, purple bell flowers, and reeds, clumsily tied with twine and left at Clara's door or on the cafe counter. He said nothing, expecting no response. But one afternoon, after 6 months of persistence, Clara took a bouquet directly from his hands the first time he offered one in person. She looked at the flowers, their petals slightly crumpled from his tight grip, and smiled. It wasn't the radiant smile of the old Clara, but it was her first genuine one since arriving in Greenfield. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice faint but sincere. Edward stood there, barely breathing, afraid to shatter the fragile moment. Clara began to change, however, slowly. She no longer avoided Edward's gaze when they worked together and started speaking in short sentences. "How's the coffee today?" Or, "You burned the bread again." Each word, however simple, was a step forward for Edward. He asked for nothing more, didn't press for forgiveness or love. He only wanted her to live, truly live, whether that included him or not. Time passed, and spring came to Greenfield, bringing green fields and warm sunlight. Clara, though still frail, began to regain vitality. One day, she brought an old sketchbook to a field, sat under an oak tree, and drew. Her first pencil strokes were shaky, but she sketched wildflowers, the dirt road, the town silhouette. Edward, watching from afar, felt his heart ache, yet swell with hope. Clara was finding herself again, piece by piece. She started teaching art to the town's children, offering free classes at the community center. She sat among them, guiding them to draw suns, trees, and dreams. Their laughter and innocence were a balm for her wounds. Edward often stood outside, watching her through a window, her eyes brighter though still tinged with sadness. He didn't intrude, unwilling to disrupt the world she was rebuilding. He continued to stay by her side, never crossing boundaries. He fixed her stuck window, repainted her fence, and learned to bake cookies from the cafe owner to bring to her classes. He stopped asking for forgiveness, stopped mentioning the past. He only wanted to know he was there, whether she needed him or not. A year passed since Edward found Clara in Greenfield. She was no longer a lifeless shadow. She was thin but stronger, her cheeks rosier, her eyes beginning to sparkle. She drew more, her vibrant paintings adorning her small home. She smiled more, not as brightly as before, but enough for the town to see Clara Bennett returning. In his simple home, Edward kept a dried wildflower bouquet, the first Clara had accepted from him. He didn't know if she could love him again, but he didn't need an answer. He loved her, and that love was enough to keep him there, enough to make him patient, even for a lifetime. Each day, he watched Clara from a distance, seeing her draw, teach, and live again. Knowing that though the past couldn't be erased, he would spend his life protecting the new light in her. In her heart, Clara began to feel Edward's presence as no longer a burden. She saw him fix her house, pick flowers, stand in the rain to offer her an umbrella. She wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, ready to love, but she no longer wanted him to leave. One afternoon, when he gave her a drawing he'd made, a clumsy daisy, she laughed, sound clear and bright in the field. "You're terrible at this," she said, but kept the sketch, her fingers tracing the pencil lines. In that moment, Edward knew that though the road ahead was long, they had begun to heal, not just Clara, but him too. His love, undemanding and unyielding, was slowly bringing her back from the darkness, and he would never give up. Spring bloomed vibrantly in Greenfield. The wildflower fields stretched endlessly under a radiant golden sun. White daisies, purple bellflowers and reeds swayed in the gentle breeze, whispering of new life. Clara Bennett stood in the midst of the field, wearing a simple white dress, her brown hair loose, a few strands dancing in the wind. She held a sketchbook, her fingers tracing pencil lines to capture the beauty before her. A year after Edward Mercer found her in this small town, Clara had slowly reclaimed herself. Not the radiant Clara of old, but a new Clara, stronger, bearing the scars of her past yet filled with hope. Edward watched from a distance beneath the shade of an ancient oak, his heart swelling with love. He was no longer the dazzling millionaire CEO of London. Now he was a simple man in a blue shirt, muddy boots, and a heart devoted to her. For the past year in Greenfield, he had quietly protected Clara, fixing her roof, picking wildflowers, working beside her at the cafe without asking for anything in return. He didn't beg for forgiveness or push her to love him again. He only showed through unwavering presence that his love was real, even if it meant waiting a lifetime. Today he knew the moment had come, not to atone for his mistakes or erase the past, but to tell Clara what he had held in his heart for so long. He took a deep breath, his hand clutching a handmade wildflower crown, daisies and reeds clumsily tied with twine, imperfect but brimming with his heart. He walked toward her, his pulse racing with each step, drawing him closer to a new destiny. Clara looked up at the sound of his footsteps. She saw Edward, his deep blue eyes glowing in the sunlight, no longer cold but tender as they had been for her throughout the year. She closed her sketchbook, offering a soft smile, now more familiar though still tinged with a trace of sadness. Picking flowers again, she teased, her voice light, but her gaze warmer than ever. Edward stopped a few steps away. He didn't smile or reply to her jest. Instead, he knelt in the sun-drenched field, the wildflower crown trembling in his hands. "Clara," he began, his voice low but steady, each word carved from his soul. "I'm done apologizing. I've said it 1,000 times, and I know words can't undo what you've endured. I don't dare ask you to forget or forgive. I only ask to be by your side for the rest of my life." Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks, but she didn't turn away. She looked at him, her eyes no longer empty, but brimming with emotion, pain, love, and a fragile spark of hope. Edward lifted the wildflower crown, its petals slightly crumpled from his awkward hands, and continued, "I don't promise you the world because the world has hurt you. I only promise to spend every day loving you, protecting you, and making you smile. Even just once, if you give me a chance, I'll spend my life proving you are my everything." Clara stood still as a spring breeze wove through her hair, carrying the sweet scent of flowers. She remembered the dark days, losing Lily, losing Faith, losing herself. She recalled Edward's cold eyes when he cast her out, and his tender ones when he knelt for her in the rain. She thought of the months he stayed in Greenfield, fixing her house, leaving flowers, standing in the rain to offer her an umbrella. He never pushed, never demanded, only waited patiently as if his entire world revolved around her. She stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling. Edward looked up, barely daring to breathe, afraid to shatter this delicate moment. "You hurt me," she said, her voice choked, "but you also brought me back. I don't know if I can love the way I once did, but I know I don't want to live without you." Edward took her hand, the wildflower crown falling to the grass, but he didn't care. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid she might vanish. "Oh, wait," he whispered, his voice shaking. "However long it takes, whatever you need, I'll wait. Just let me stay by your side." She held out her wrist, and he slipped the wildflower crown onto it, its soft petals embracing her skin like a vow. "Yes," she said, her voice clear. "I'll marry you." They held each other in the flower-strewn field, spring sunlight bathing them, illuminating two hearts once shattered. No more contracts, no conditions, no binds of the past, only Edward and Clara, two souls who had walked through darkness to find each other, free and whole in their love. He kissed her forehead, gentle as if fearing to break a dream, and Clara leaned into his chest, her heartbeat blending with his. The wildflower field stood as a silent witness, blessing their new journey. They had lost each other, endured pain, but now, in the dawn after the long night, they found each other again, not to fix the past, but to write a future together.